my pleasure to talk to you today about a very special aspect of the Upchurch family. And this has to do with how we came to know so much about our English heritage. I've previously indicated that our ancestor, Michael Upchurch, was the ancestor of all American Upchurches. But there's a great deal to the story about where he came from in England and what his family was like there. And so a great deal of effort by various Upchurch researchers has been devoted to learning more about Michael Upchurch. Of course, we know that this all started with the fact that he wrote 4 letters back to England in the 1650s. And I, in fact, in 1979 or 1989, attempted to see those letters. My wife and I went to Cambridge University, where they're located. But for some reason they were having midterm examinations and they would not let us get close to the letters. So as a feeble effort to do something, I left my business card there with an indication that I would like to have someone contact me about the letters if anyone was interested or cared. Well, a little time went by, a year or so, and one day I got a letter from a person named Professor David Ransome. And he indicated in his letter that he had found my business card at the gate at Cambridge University and that he had considerable interest because he was processing the papers of the Farrar family. Now, buried in those papers are the letters that our ancestor Michael Upchurch wrote to back to England from Surrey County, Virginia in America. So we commenced a correspondence from that point on. And it so happened that Professor Ransome was positioned to know a huge amount about how the English system worked, how the records were kept, and he could read Old English. It just happened that that had been part of his life and the way he lived and the kinds of things he did and the kinds of academic exercises that intrigued him. So when we invited him to help us learn more about Michael Upchurch in England, he stepped forward and did so. Now, we did pay him a modest amount of money to do this, and in fact, now for over 20 years, we have continued to engage Professor Ransome in an effort to dig out more and more details about the Upchurch family in England. And over the years, we've published probably 25 reports from Professor Ransome about various aspects of our Upchurch family in England, and in some cases, how the Upchurches moved to places other than America. Now, in interacting with Professor Ransome, I have to tell you that the Upchurch family has one of the greatest bargains of all times, because the more or less pittance that we paid him, perhaps maybe an average of $1,000 a year, you couldn't buy that from a professional genealogist or researcher for $10,000 a year. Now, I've tried to report all of this faithfully in the Upchurch Bulletin, and those records are there for anyone to see who can reach the Upchurch Bulletin in a library or some other place. But we've continued in our association with Professor Ransome, and he's even visited in our home in the St. Louis area. He also led a tour for us in along about 2000 when a group of American Upchurches decided to go to England. And I, in fact, have a picture I can show of Professor Ransome standing in a lovely red sweater along with myself and Cousin Peggy Harris. Now, Cousin Peggy Harris is another Upchurch researcher. She is a great-granddaughter of William George Upchurch, who was a very prominent businessman in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was my great-uncle. And Peggy has gone on to write the story of her whole family, and she has a chapter of great-uncle William George Upchurch in her book. So we were delighted to have Peggy and her family join us on this trip to England. I should say another word about this money aspect. You know, it's a shame to be talking about money all the time. We hear about it every Sunday when we go to church. But, you know, Upchurch research takes some money. And I've stepped up to bat from time to time, and I really appreciate all the people over the years who've made contributions of various kinds. Not only monetary contributions, but there are Upchurches who have spent thousands of hours researching their part of the family and have turned it over to me to have those records. And I've tried to get them into the Upchurch Bulletin and into other records we have, and have arranged to preserve them in perpetuity. We'll tell you about that story another time. But there is more to be said about the Upchurch family and our Upchurch roots in England. I can't recommend any higher authority than going to the Upchurch Bulletin and reading the various stories. As a testimony to the continued association we have with Professor Ransome, it occurred to me in recent months to contact Professor Ransome and to say to him, well, you've taught us a great deal about our ancestor Michael Upchurch in England, but we wonder what conditions were like during those times. Now, we obviously don't have any detailed letters describing what times were like, but I invited Professor Ransome to write an article on what things were most likely like in England at the time Michael and his family lived there, during the period, let's say, from 1600 to 1650. Of course, Michael left in 1638, and he has penned a more or less two-page article, which we paid him for, not a handsome sum, but at least some bucks. And I'd like just to read you a couple of excerpts from this. Now, it'll appear in the upcoming Upchurch Bulletin, and we'll start with it, just the opening paragraph. He says, here, it's entitled, "The Little World He Left Behind. Michael Upchurch Sails for Virginia, David R. Ransome." When sturdy Michael Upchurch left Brington for Virginia in 1638, it was probably the first time he had been more than 10 miles from his home. He was leaving not only his family and village, but also abandoning a cultivated landscape where the inhabitants acknowledged a gradation of social ranks, an established Christian, indeed Protestant church, and a hereditary king. Now then he goes on to tell about the various things you can conclude about the Upchurch circumstances that persisted, and I'll just draw your attention to the last paragraph. It says, "At all events, though Michael never returned home, he was sturdily fortunate. He survived the long transatlantic voyage, the dangerous first season in the James Valley, and his participation in the 1644 campaign against the elderly Opachanahu Indian. By his presence in Virginia, moreover, he escaped involvement in the Civil War that erupted in England in 1642, and more especially the ransacking of Brington by Royalist troops in 1645. Nearly 400 years after Michael's birth, his descendants are to be found throughout the United States, while in England his Upchurch kin have similarly spread across the country. Some are still resident in Huntingdonshire, though not in Brington itself." I hope this gives you a little bit of an inkling of how valuable Professor Ransome has been to the Upchurch family, and we thank him profoundly.
Thank you.